The first example that I wanted to show you is a simple application of the ELL method, the World Bank method, to estimate poverty in Bangladesh that has been done by the Statistical Office of Bangladesh in 2010. In this particular example, the goal is to estimate, obtain small area estimates of the incidence of monetary poverty and extreme poverty. So they have two poverty lines. They're going to have a variable of income, and they want to estimate the number of people that falls below the first poverty line or below the second poverty line. The geography of interest for them, in the case of Bangladesh, Bangladesh has, I believe, up to 4 levels of geography that are administrative. Like in Colombia, we could talk about regions and then departments and then municipalities and so on. In the case of Bangladesh, you have the first level is called divisions, and there are only 8, I believe. Then the next level is going to be districts, and there's something like 60. And then the next level, which I presume in the case of Colombia would be something like municipality or something like that, is called upazila. The whole area of Bangladesh, which is a rather big country, Bangladesh has something like 140 million people, is divided in 544 domains. So you can imagine that if they have 140 million people and 544 domains, then this upazila domain is bigger than our municipality in that sense. We have like what, 1,000 municipalities, something like that, and we only have like 45 million people. So upazila is small, but it's not so small as a domain. And that is the level of at which they would like to produce the estimates of poverty, upazila. Which data sources do they have to produce those estimates? They go by the standard, very standard approach, which is using data from the Household Income and Expenditure Survey, which is the survey that they have that collects income, and data from the population census. So these figures are expected to be useful for 2010. The census happened in 2011, but they're going to ignore that 1 year gap in between the census and the survey. They're close enough. And they're going to use the data from the population census and then the survey, which indeed corresponds to the year of interest, 2010. Okay, how is that survey designed? Well, that survey is a survey that is, I believe, is stratified and is designed to provide estimates at level 1 only. There was, I say here 7 divisions. I thought there were 8, but okay, so 7 divisions. That the country is split in. So it's, if you want to imagine, so it would be like if the HEIH was designed to provide estimates at the region rather than department or whatever level. It's only 7 divisions. And the sample size is also not particularly big. They have 12,000 households that are interviewed. I don't know if anybody can tell me what is the sample size of the HEIH over a year, for example, in terms of households.
We have 700,000 of individuals in 22,000 of households.
Tell me again, how many households? 200,000?
22, wait. I think that I can test you from using the chat.
It's okay. It's just it's a good idea if it's 20,000 or 200,000. That would be. But in any case, you see, it's much bigger than this survey, for example, and it's designed for a population that is a third of the size of the population of Bangladesh. Or Colombia should have something like 45. You see, 220,000 households. These guys have 12,000 households. I mean, one thing that I have realized with the case of Colombia is Colombia has lots of data, like lots of data, and should be able to produce very, very good estimates because you have a really, really big survey. So if you see, the survey in Colombia is 20 times the size of this survey for a population that at national level is 1/3 of a size. Just to give you some ideas of the sizes that we're talking about. So they're going to be using those 2 data sources and the ELL method. So I don't know if you are familiar with the ELL method. Nikos is going to explain it in detail in his section of unit level models. So here I'm just going to give you the very the more general characteristics of the method. The idea is that you have income in the survey, but you don't have income in the census. So what you're going to do is that you're going to go in the survey and you're going to identify the income or expenditure or consumption or whichever variable that you're going to use to define the poverty. And then you're going to formulate a regression model that allows you to predict that, let's say, income or consumption variable in the survey. Okay? The variables that you're going to use on the right-hand side as x's, your predictors, they have to be variables that are common between the survey and the census. So let's say you can use things like, for example, the distribution of the population by age and sex, because that is going to be in the two sources. You can use things like the labor force status, if people is employed, unemployed. They are not measured exactly the same way in those two sources, but you can see whether they are close enough as to be considered a similar variable. You may have some information about the households, household size, the I don't know how to say that in English, hacinamiento, the number of people per compared to the number of rooms, and things like that. Whether they have some assets, if you have any information on that in the census, but whichever variables you use for that regression model have to be available in the census as well, okay? Then you build a regression model that explains, let's say, income on the basis of those variables, that predicts income on the basis of those variables. Usually, the model is formulated not for consumption or expenditure, but for the logarithm of that variable, because it's a linear model, and you know that income or expenditure or consumption tend to be very skewed variables. So that wouldn't work very well with just a simple linear regression model. So you transform that variable. Yeah, I don't know if you realize Nikos mentioned like many times in the timetable when he talks about model-based estimates, he mentioned transformations, arcs in transformations, and so on. Those transformations show up, but the arc scene is because of proportions, but some of the transformations show up because you have this problem of non-normality on the response variable, which is income in this case, or consumption. So you formulate the model for the log consumption using those common variables in the census and in the survey. And then once you have fitted the model in the survey, you take that model, you take those regression coefficients that you estimated in the survey, and you predict income in the census using now the same predictors, but not in the ones observed in the survey, the ones observed in the census, and the same regression coefficients that you estimated on the survey. Now, of course, that there is a big assumption about that already. You're assuming that the regression coefficients that held for the survey are the same that would be holding well for the census. That's a big assumption, and that's an assumption that may be threatened, for example, if the two things measure the variables in a very different way. So if, for example, unemployment is measured completely different, so that you don't really have those variables that are close enough, or if there is a big time gap between the census and the survey, all those things may make problematic that assumption that the same regression model exactly holds in the census. But if you can assume that, then you can take that regression model and predict income or consumption for each one of the households in the census data. And now you have the income in the census that was what you wanted in the first place. Okay, then there is a little bit about how to obtain an estimator from there. And what you do is that you don't really do this once, you do many times. So you generate many versions, simulated versions of income in a particular census. And then you get an estimate of poverty that is based on an average of those different repetitions of simulated consumption or income. You use that repetition to get your point estimates and also to get your variance estimate or your indicator of interest. Now, this is a methodology that has been very popular because, as I was saying, the fact, for example, that you predict income at the household level means that you can calculate incidence of poverty, but you can also calculate the gap of poverty. You can calculate Gini indices. You can calculate deciles, quantiles, whatever you want to do. There are many things that you can do because you now have the whole distribution. And calculating all those indicators is as simple as if you have them in the census. There is not much more than you have to do. So, so this method is very popular because of that. That's called the Elbers, Lanjou, and Lanjou method, or World Bank method. In the case of this application for Bangladesh, this is the kind of map that they ended up with after having predicted income and calculating those poverty measures. You can see this is just like the map that you would obtain regardless of the method, to be honest. There are things here that you're going to discuss with Nikos. For example, estimators that come from this type of methodologies, they tend to have a lower range of variation than the estimate that you would have obtained, for example, if you were using survey data. So let's say if poverty were to vary between 20 and 40%, here it may vary between, I don't know, 30 and 40, something like that. And the range is a bit, it's a bit reduced in some cases. So you have to be mindful of that, because sometimes then the map looks more flat than what it should look. It looks more homogeneous than what it would look otherwise. But this is the estimate that they get in that case. Just to give you an idea of which kind of variables they included in their model, they included things like proportion distributions of population, so proportion of children that are age 1 to 4, or proportion of children that are 11 to 15 and attend school. They include variables such as household size and household tenure, whether they're owners, whether they're rented, whether they live with extended family or not, these kind of things. They include other like basic demographic variables, such as the distribution by sex, the distribution by gender, level of education, religion and marital status in this type of countries is extremely relevant. I'm not sure how relevant that would be in the case of Colombia, for example. But here is very relevant, religious and marital status of the household head, whether this is a woman who's the head of the household, whether it's a Muslim woman or it's a Christian woman. Those things matter a lot in terms of the income of the household. There are some characteristics of the house, like and the household, like access to electricity or not, and the source of the water, and whether they access to a sanitary latrine or not. And they also include variables in the model that are not at the household level. So all of those that I mentioned before go at the household level. So you can, for example, count how many children 1 to 4 live in this household. It may be 0, it may be 1, it may be 2. But the last two variables, distribution of household by tenure and proportion of people working in the service sector, are contextual variables. So those are variables that were calculated at the upasila level. So they're going to take the whole domain, the upasila, and they're going to count how many of the households that live in that upasila lives in an owned house, or rent the house they live in, for example, for the distribution by tenure. So those are contextual variables, are not at the household level, but at the upasila level, and they are also included in the model. So including these type of variables is going to be helpful to explain differences between different upasilas, okay? And they also include the proportion of people there that it works in the services sector. These are examples of variables that they include in their model. Then other things that they can do. So then the method as such, the ELL method is tested. There is not much more that you would let's say the construction of the regression model is something that is very important. But then what happens with the rest of the methodology is something that is well known. Then the last bit is about validation statistics. So in this particular application, for example, they compare their estimates. They use, you can compare estimates with other estimates that come from other sources, for example, or you can aggregate estimates at higher levels of aggregation where the direct estimates, the ones that come from the survey, are considered reliable, and then you can see how well they match. Okay, so in this case, for example, they have a strata that is the division. Okay, so what they're going to do is that they know that the survey is designed to give accurate estimates at the division level. So they take the accurate estimates of poverty that you can calculate from the survey at the division level, and then they take the model-based estimates at the upasila level, aggregate them at the division level, and then compare those two. If those two estimates are highly correlated, then that is one good indication. It's a good thing about your estimates, okay? They are showing that in the report, The correlation between those two sets of estimates is 0.98, so it's extremely high. Now, it's good that they agree at aggregate levels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are good at lower levels. That's one validation criteria, but it's not the only thing. Other of the validation statistics that they calculate, for example, they calculate the percentage of variability that is explained by the model. So they have something like an R-squared type of measure to try to give a number of how good is the prediction that they're making of the consumption in this case. And the model that they formulated here is what different models for each one of the divisions. So this is why I say variable, but around 50%. That's more or less how much they manage to explain from the consumption. In some divisions is higher, in some divisions is lower. Other of the validation statistics that they use the proportion of variance due to the domains, just to see how much clustering there is in those in the model. And they found that there is less than 10% in all the models that they formulated. They formulated different models for each one of the strata. This kind of validation statistics is something that we're gonna talk about much later when we talk about the framework. How do you validate those small area estimates? Okay, so this is just a very standard application. I don't know if you are familiar already with the ELL method. And as I said, Nikos is gonna cover it in much more detail later on in his section. This is just for you to have an idea of how people is using this type of methods for poverty mapping. Any questions about this bit? Tell me, Paula. Your microphone is muted. Okay, go on.
Yes, that's okay. I have two questions. The first is about the bootstrap method. I understand that in the ELL method, that is the World Bank method, it's necessary to take into account the bootstrap method, but it's not clear for me that part of the model, of the methodology. So it will be very interesting to understand that, because I understood with the literature review that is really important that. The other thing is, I'm not sure, but this is one paper that I found that was published in 2020. I'm not sure, but it's part of that paper. I'm not sure if the example is about it.
This particular example?
Yes.
No, there are actually, I think there is a more recent version of ELL application for Bangladesh. No, this is because Nikos and I were working with a project with this type of data a couple of years ago, and that was the one that was the most recent published at that point. This, I all the information that I have in this example is taken from the report, not from a paper. But I'm sure there is other examples. You can find all applications of ELL are different because they differ depending on which variables are variable in the survey, what are the characteristics of the survey of each country. But the steps of the method seem to be pretty standard. I'm going to leave the bootstrap thing to Nikos.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Paula, don't worry about the bootstrap. You will, by the end of this course, you will be fed up by bootstraps. So there's a lot of bootstraps going on. Okay, so and actually the software tools that we are giving you include bootstrap mean squared error estimates by default. So you will be able to implement fairly quickly, but we will describe it, and so don't worry about it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, because I have the other idea about if this example was about the 2020 of Iman and other authors was the paper, but for me it's just clear.
It's fine. We will cover all of that.
But the methodology is going to be the same. I mean, the bootstrap part, the bootstrap has to come here at the end. So when I said repeat those last two steps 100 times, so basically what I was saying is you generate a simulated income using that model, and then you don't do it once. You do it many times, and then the final estimate that you obtain is based on all those repetitions, and your estimate of the variance or the mean square error is based on how much those different estimates vary from one sample to another, basically.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's the basic idea.
Thank you.
So now, thank you so much, Paula. Any other questions? ELL, as I was saying, Nikos is gonna explain it much better. You're gonna see the model, you're gonna see the model equations and all the assumptions and so on, as well as practical suggestions for when you're applying the method in his part when he talks about more poverty mapping. Now I'm going to present, this is a completely different example. It's also measuring poverty, but it's in a situation where the data availability is completely different, and therefore they also decided to go in a completely different direction for producing the estimates. So this is an example that comes from here, from the UK. Is a production of synthetic income estimates. I found that very interesting. They have been publishing, they publish estimates. The most recent ones are the ones of 2018, and we're in 2022. So you can imagine that is also because they use some administrative data and other sources to produce them. And they have a very, very interesting way to visualize those estimates. So just for you to have an idea, the goal of this application is to produce estimates of mean, average, equivalized, disposable annual household income. So they're not predicting poverty directly. They're going to tell you what is the average income. And then there is whether it's equivalized or not equivalized, whether include housing costs or not include housing costs and so on. And the level of aggregation that they're using here is called the middle super output area. So in the UK, I talked a little bit about the geography of Bangladesh, that you have division, district, and the Upasilas. In the case of the UK, the National Statistical Office, the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, has done a big work on producing different geographies for statistical purposes. So they have something that is called the super output areas, the middle super output areas, the lower super output areas, and so on. And then these are I'm gonna give you a description of how big an MSOA is, okay? So MSOAs, the domains of interest, are built in such a way that each MSOA has on average between 5,000 and 15,000 households. That's more or less the size of an MSOA. England, the whole England and Wales, they end up split in this case on around 7,000 small areas. That's the number of domains that they have. I wanted to show you, just if you have the slides, if you click here, you can see. I wanted to show you that, so let me just share that screen window. I want to show you this one. Okay, so this is, if you click on that link, then it drives you here where they have published those estimates that I'm talking about, and then here you have the whole description of the method. And you can see the visualization, to me, this part of visualization is really, really interesting. You can do things like check your postcode, or you can go as low as you want. And then you see here they have incomes varying between £11,000 and £67,000. When you get closer, then they tell you this is the size of the MSOA. That is a given MSOA. So, and then you'll be able to see what are these, or those are the houses. This is a park, whatever, the roads and so on. And then you can see how the average income changes by areas. Okay, so I think it's very impressive, the type of visualization that they have. Let me just go back to so if you want to give a look to that later on when you have some spare time, I think it's really nice. And then they have, ONS has a big tradition of being, I think, considered very good in terms of reporting what they do and why they do it and how do they validate their estimates and so on. So there is a lot of documentation as well about this particular example that you may find interesting. So I was mentioning, what is the goal? The goal is to produce yearly estimates of that average household income. They have 4 different types of income, depending on, again, household costs, equalized or not, and so on, at that domain that is called MSOA, that contains around 5,000 and 15,000 households. Tell me, Jose.
Do you know if these statistics has the official status, or has like any other status within national statistics like experimental or they are like hard statistics like anyone, like any other, like unemployment rate, for example. They are consolidated official maturity statistic or not?
Yes, you are very well informed, Jose. Yes, so ONS publishes something when they're trying and they're seeing how it works and whether the users respond well to them and gathering feedback to see how their things work and so on. They are called experimental statistics. Once they're consolidated, they acquire the status of official statistics. These are actually official statistics.
Okay.
These are actually official statistics. Okay, now let me talk a little bit about how these statistics are produced. So we're trying to predict income, average income. Income is collected in several surveys, in several different sources, and they're going to make a combination of some of them. So it's collected on a regular basis by several surveys, but also by administrative records. So this particular application uses a household weekly income from the DWP Family Resources Survey. So that is actually a survey that is done by ONS, but paid by the Department for Work and Pensions. But it's the field work and everything is done by ONS. It's owned by the Department of Work and Pensions, but the field work is done by ONS. This application uses data from 2017 to 2018. Now, how is that survey, for you to have an idea? So that survey has a stratified two-stage sampling design, where in the first stage, they select postcodes, which is quite a small geography already. If you compare, for example, with the HEIH that I believe selects municipalities. So postcodes would be a much, much more disaggregated geography, which is fantastic because you make sure that you have sample everywhere. You're less likely to have areas that have no sample at all, but it's also much more expensive. So they select postcodes in the first stage using a proportional to size sampling design, and then they select dwellings that would be like houses, let's say, using simple random sampling. There is a little bit of hassle there about what happened, how do you do when you have more than one household in a dwelling, etc., etc., etc. But I have to say that is much less common here than what it is in Colombia to have multiple houses in a given dwelling. Something that is interesting in this case is that the geography they are interested in, which is MSOA, and the geography that is used for the survey, which is postcode, are not nested. So you could have a postcode that has pieces of two different MSOAs, for example. Okay? It's not like if your PSU was municipality and then you were interested on a postcode inside the municipality. Here, if you want to produce an estimate at the MSOA level, you may end up having to add over different postcodes because those two geographies are not nested. This sampling design is self-weighted, so they use this simple random sampling and PPS approach to make a sampling design so that the final sampling weights are basically constant. They are not exactly constant. They may vary, particularly due to non-response and non-response adjustments, but the sampling design is made in such a way that, at least in theory, on paper, is self-weighted, so that you don't have to really worry much about weighting the influence of the sampling design in the modeling part, okay? Approximated sample size for this survey, they have 19 households in a total of 1,400 PSUs. When we go and we look about the MSOAs, I said it's great that the sample size uses such a small area because then you have samples across the whole country. But when you aggregate at the MSOA level, actually you only have sample on 36% of the MSOAs that are of interest. So that problem that I was mentioning before about design-based estimation of what do you do if you have out of area domains is very clear here, because you're going to have at least 67% of the domains where you actually cannot even produce an estimate because you have no sample. Nobody went to that MSOA. Even on the MSOAs that were in the sample size ends up being quite small. You have on average 13.5 households per PSU. And if I were to aggregate that using the MSOA geography instead, then I would have 7.5 households on average per MSOA. So if you were to use something that is based on design-based, you only have 7.5 households to produce that estimate of income. You can imagine that that doesn't really seem very sustainable. So this is one of those cases where you want to go so low in terms of the geography that you wouldn't be able to plan for this level of domains. You would need a massive sample size that you probably cannot afford, and where the sample sizes in each one of those domains are definitely too small for anything in a design-based framework to be good enough, to be useful enough. All the covariate data, this is a quite interesting application in the way how they do the modeling. What they do is that they model all the covariates they process all the covariates at the MSOA level. And they use also administrative data and census data. They use census data from the 2011 census. This is 2017, so the 2011 census has passed quite a few years ago, but anyway, so that's 2017, but the census is 2011. What do they take from the census? Things like the population's distributions by age, sex, religion, social grade. That is something that very interesting that they have here in the UK, where basically you take like the occupations variable that you collect in the census, and then from that classification of ocupaciones, they build something like to say that you are a white collar worker, blue collar worker, or something like that. So it gives you a ranking of people. And of course, that is extremely good for predicting income. Things like whether it's a one-person household or not, whether the people lives in communal accommodation, what we call in Spanish leas. Then they have that information from the census. Then they have a lot of other information from administrative sources. So they have the benefit claimant from the Department of the Work and Pensions. So this is whether people is claiming any benefits from the state. I don't think we have anything. Yeah, it would be like Familias en Acción, I guess, something like that. It's a cash transfer thing, but I'm not sure it would be exactly equivalent. It's a benefit here. So they know whether someone is claiming or not benefits, and they process that as a count and as a proportion of people in the MSOA. So the actual covariate that is going to enter in the model is the number of people in the MSOA that claims benefits, or the proportion of people in the MSOA that claims benefits. It's not at an individual level or a household level. It's at MSOA level. They also use a distribution by council tax bands. So depending on how new the state, the size, whatever of the house, you're going to belong to a different council tax band. And then you're going to look at how is the distribution within the MSOA. Are the houses here mainly from the high level range, or the middle level range, or the lower level range in that council tax band distribution? They use real sale prices. They use the data from the house prices statistics. So how much a house costs in this particular area. That use real sales to build that statistic. They use data on energy consumption as well. They use data on taxes paid by for people that is working and has a salary, disaggregated by deciles of age and sex. And they also use country and region. Those are like the main two geographical variables. Then they formulate a linear mixed model where the response variable is the logarithm of income, and all those covariates are coming here. Okay? So here there is a little bit of a trick, because as I said, MSOA and postcode are not nested geographies. So they need to process, basically, this is the covariate, the percentage of people claiming benefit in that piece of the MSOA that falls in that postcode. So this is a model at the household postcode level. And here I have I, because I use the MSOA. So at the end of the day, they're going to feed the model at the household postcode level. This is a two-level model. But when they use it for prediction, they input here the MSOA covariates to get MSOA level predictions. They do this model per type of income. I mentioned there were 4 different types of income that they were interested in. And look at the models in this case. Those models explain around 85% of the variance between MSOA, which is actually really, really high. These models are acting very well at predicting that variability between MSOAs, which is bottom line what you want. They use a synthetic estimator that we're going to describe later what it is, where they use just the fitted fixed coefficients to predict the expected value of that log income. Now you have a logarithm, so they use a back transformation, which includes a bias correction term, because there is some bias due to the use of the fact that you're predicting the logarithm of income rather than the income directly. And then after they have done all that, they then benchmark those estimates to the estimates at the level of region and country, to the FRS, that's the initial survey that they have, the Family Resources Survey. So after they have done that, they benchmark the results so that at the higher levels where the survey was good enough, the estimates are the same as the model-based estimates. They make them the same at those big regions, England, and at the country level in the case of Wales. Now, here there's a bit of a description of how they produce the confidence intervals, how do they estimate the variability of those estimates. You can see that actually, although you can see some variability between MSOAs, the confidence bands are still quite wide. And then they do some diagnostics. We're going to talk more about this type of diagnostics again in the framework section, but things that they do, for example, they include plots of residuals versus model estimates at the two levels that the model is fitted in, using the households and using the postcodes. They do, for example, a plot of model-based versus direct-based estimate, design-based estimates. How to read those plots, we're going to see that more in the framework. They look at the proportion of model-based confidence interval that overlap with the corresponding design-based confidence intervals. They look at significant differences between the expected value of the direct and the model-based estimates. And they look at the stability of the covariates that have been chosen by in the model. So if I modify slightly the data set and I choose the covariates again, do I arrive to the same set of covariates, or do I arrive to a completely different set of covariates for my model? So as you can see, this is a completely different exercise that is is conducted in a different way, because they have a different set of data sources that they can put together. Nothing of that is linked at the individual level. All of that is calculated at the MSOA level, which makes things much easier. As a recap of those two examples, in both cases, we have survey data, which is the one that measures the response in the target population, but sample sizes of the survey are too small to provide useful estimates at the intended level of aggregation, MSOA in one case and UPACILAS in the other one. In both cases, we have auxiliary sources, which are going to provide covariates that are used to predict the outcome of interest. In both cases, the performance will rely heavily on the quality of the auxiliary data and how strong are the associations between the auxiliary data and my outcome. If that is not a good predictor, there is no chance I'm going to get a much better estimate. They use models at different levels. So in the case of the Bangladesh exercise, that goes at the household level. In the case of the MSOA estimates, they go at the MSOA level. It's an area level model. Estimates and model diagnostics and subject expertise are important components of the assessment of the methodology. If you have a bit of time to go through the documentation of this example that I have included here as a footnote, it's very interesting to see how do they validate those estimates. And they are published by relevant uncertainty measures. Again, one per point estimate. It's not one uncertainty measure for the whole set of estimates, but rather every one of them have its own level of uncertainty. And that's all with my two examples. I have a question from Paula. Go on.
Yes, I have two questions. The first is about the size of the sample. No. The first is about the covariates. Yep. I have the question about do we have a criteria to determine to select the covariates that we have in the model? Because I see that it's like I'm not sure if it's a trial and error, because I see that is try to find the percentage that explain the variance. But I'm not sure how can select if we have a specific criteria to determine how can we select that covariates. That's the first question. The other thing that I have to ask is about the criteria to determine the sample. If the sample is large, is enough large? Because I understand that we need to have a large sample to go to the synthetic estimator when we have this type of model, ELL model. I'm not sure if we have a specific criteria to determine the size of that sample, or I start to predict and I saw that I go to the synthetic estimator when I start to predict, or I have a specific criteria to determine that before to predict.
Do you want to go, Nico? Do I go?
Sorry.
Okay.
So the first question was about the model selection criteria. And again, this is part of what we will cover next week. There are different criteria you can use. So you can use like different model selection criteria, and software now will do this job for you automatically. So there are some step functions into software that will allow you to specify some kind of criterion. So you can use standard criteria like the AIC, BIC criterion to try and get a model that fits best the data. One thing we haven't included in the course, but it starts speaking a bit more popularity, is some penalized criteria where effectively you penalize for overfitting, because it's quite easy effectively to throw, especially if you have a very rich set of covariates from various data sources, including geospatial information. You can throw a lot of variables in, and then you end up overfitting. So there are some criteria which penalize overfitting and attempt to basically take that into account. So we will see some of these criteria. So that's the first question. The second question, and so it's a trial and error. So sometimes you let the model run and see what it comes up with, and then you maybe, depending on the access to the data, you can try and engage yourself a bit more with the model building in order to try and feel comfortable about what the software is speaking for you. The other question was about some rule of thumb in terms of sample sizes, if I understood it correctly. And Angela probably will cover that at some point, but and we covered that as part of the framework. But you know, the use of models in small area estimation is a tricky part. So let me put it that way: if national statistical offices could do without the use of models, it would have been great, right? Because you don't have to make assumptions. Yeah. You don't have to worry about residual diagnostics. You don't have to worry about model selection and so on, right? So I would say, I mean, my approach to this, and is my approach to these things, is that start with some basic, not basic, but some standard estimators that national statistical offices feel comfortable with, right? Get those as part of your estimation process. Get your quality measures like coefficients of variation and variances, and then stop at that point and say, are these estimates good enough? If you're in a fortunate position that these estimates are good enough, they're good enough. The only reason then to use models is to try and see if there is anything else the model can offer you to try and improve a bit the precision, right? But say, you know, some offices might have a coefficient of variation threshold of about 20%. So if you're lucky enough in Dana to get your direct estimates or some model-assisted estimates with coefficients of variation below 20% or around 20%, great, right? In most cases, this is not the case, because the level of geography is pretty low, right? And even if that was the case for those areas where you have sample data, it will not be the case for areas where you don't have sample data. So if you don't have sample data, if you have out of sample areas, then almost building a model and going for a synthetic type estimator in this case would be almost determined by the level of geography. So I always say, before you start a small area estimation project, think about the level of geography which is absolutely necessary, assess the coverage of the sample data, get your initial estimates in, assess the initial estimates, and then move forward with models only if you require, for some reason, to use a model. That will be my approach. I wouldn't set rules of thumb in terms of sample sizes, because what determines the final decision, it's a combination of point estimation and variance estimation. Variance estimation depends on the sample size, but also the coefficient of variation is a function of both things. So because it's the ratio of the two. And so it's very difficult to set a rule of thumb there, okay? It depends what you're measuring. Angela.
Yeah, I think with the first part of the question about the variables, I think one thing that is key is which method do you use? So the distinction that Nikos was making is very straightforward to see in the two examples that I have shown. So if you think about the example of the Bangladesh ELL, the first thing that I need is that whichever variables I'm going to include in my model, they have to be both in the census and in the survey. So I already started with a massive constraint. I would have much better variables to predict income from the survey if I could use everything that is in the survey. But I can't use everything that is in the survey because the method asks me to use variables that are common in the census and in the survey. So that already determines one first. That's a big restriction to start with. Okay, that's one thing. In the second example, or in any example where you're using an area level model, then there is no that restriction, particularly the examples that the one that Nikos is going to present, for example, when you have a very rich set of covariates. That not necessarily, very rich doesn't necessarily mean very predictive, by the way. But if you have 250 covariates because you had remote sensing data and you measured you squeeze those satellite images to the bottom of everything that you can be measured from them, then you end up with 250 covariates, which is a very rich number of covariates, where you're going to have to just go for something that is an automatic method to select covariates. Then you can use some penalized regression, or you can use some stepwise function or whatever to try to find a reasonable set of covariates. But you see, those two scenarios, for example, are completely different to start with. Now, I would say bottom line, whatever you do, either way, it's a prediction problem. So you want to build a model that is good to predict the response. And you econometrists know how to do that. That's the idea, to build a model that is good to predict your response. And then we don't claim that those models are mechanicistic in the sense that you don't claim that those variables truly generate that response. But the functional form, the correctness, the validity of the functional form, it's important in terms of the validity of your results. Okay, that I would say respect to your first question. And about the second one, that is something that we have actually been discussing in most of the framework that we're going to discuss at the end is based on a paper that we published now it's like 5 years ago. Sort of. But anyway, where the idea is, one of the things that we were trying to do with that paper is to say that if you want to produce a small area estimates at the municipality level, for example, you don't start at municipality level. You go sequentially. Take a sequential approach that takes you one step at a time so that you're not out there not knowing with what to compare your estimates. But if you go to a sequential approach, then let's say you have direct estimates at the region level. Okay, now you have something. And then you can calculate estimates at the department level. They are still direct. And then maybe you can see the coefficients of variation. They may be quite good. Then you go one level below. You look at the municipality ones. And then if, for example, in the case of Colombia, I'm thinking about now, Colombian surveys, the HEIH in particular is absolutely massive. It's really, really big in the context of household surveys. But if I'm correct, you guys can correct me if I'm not, I think the survey design involves selection of municipalities as PSUs. Am I right? So you see, if you selected enumeration areas from the census, you may have few municipalities out of sample with that level of sample size. But because you select municipalities, then that means that you have a bunch of municipalities that are just not in sample. You're done. See what I mean? So as soon as you go from department to municipality, you have to do something that is not design-based, not because your sample size is small, but because the way how the sample has been designed by construction leaves out already a bunch of domains that are of interest. So you cannot do anything design-based that. You have zero sample size. You may have very large sample sizes for the ones that are in sample. So cities like the 13 main areas, there were 13 in my time, I don't know how many are they now, but the main areas, the main capitals, they have massive sample sizes. You don't need to do anything model based in that. But there is a lot of other bunch of municipalities that have sample size zero. So you have to make something that is a combination of those two things. But the idea is that how big the sample size has to be. You see, that is a very specific problem. I have no idea. But the only thing that I could say is if you follow a sequential approach, then you're never truly lost. Because if you don't know where you are, you can always look one level up, and whatever estimates you're generating, they have to be somehow consistent with what was happening one level above, you know? You always have like a bit of controls so that you know what are you doing.
Thank you so much.
By the way, great questions. So that's what we want. We want questions of that kind because it helps us a lot to focus a bit more the training. Even if it takes us a few days more, I think it's important to have the questions. Thank you, Paula, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. We're 15 minutes on top of time already. And I think I finished with the examples that I had. And then what I would do is I would stop here. And then tomorrow is 3 hours, right? We're done.
On Wednesday. On Wednesday.
Sorry, Wednesday. Sorry, Wednesday. Then on Wednesday, we can start with the basics of the basics of design frames, inference framework. I'm not going to tell you all the details, but because first, we don't have the time. And second, I don't think you have the need. I don't think you are the guys that process or obtain those estimates. You're not the ones that obtain those estimates, but you need to know how they're obtained to be able to know how to use them. So I'm going to enter with the design-based inference framework tomorrow. Okay, Wednesday. Sorry. Okay, I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I would suggest we stop here and we meet on Wednesday at your 9 a.m.
Fantastic.
Anybody else?
Any questions? No. Can we just get some feedback? Does it go well, the discussions and the materials we cover up to now, and the material will become even more involved with the actual work that you're trying to do, but up to now, is everything okay?
Yes.
Okay. Please give us feedback on the go, dynamic feedback, because that will help us to improve things if we want to, if we need to improve things and change things a bit, you know. But otherwise, I think Angela and possibly myself for part of the time will see you on Wednesday and then on Friday.